Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History of I podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Warren Carter. And today's discussion is based on his book that he co-wrote, Early Judaism and the New Testament, Troubling Misunderstandings. Warren co-wrote the book with Professor Ariel Feldman, and the link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment just below that. With that being said, Warren, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure, Jacob. Good to see you.
Likewise. All right, to start us off, what was the Jewish messianic expectations, and do the four Gospels how do the four Gospels interpret and treat them?
Yeah, Christians have often claimed, and we talk about this in the book, that all Jews were waiting for the Messiah, one expectation, one job description. And when Jesus didn't meet those expectations, they decided to kill him. So what we need to understand is that expectations around a Messiah were multiple and minimal. So if you like alliteration, I can do it again. They weren't pervasive, and expectations were peripheral. That is, there's no Hebrew Bible text or texts that use Messiah or Christ to predict a future coming powerful ruling figure. They do use the language for anointed kings, anointed priests, anointed prophets, and even for the Persian king Cyrus, who is anointed to send the folks back to the land, Isaiah 45, verse 1. In early Judaism, we don't have a lot of references to a Messiah, though we do have some. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, we've got some scattered references, which aren't particularly detailed, but there are actually references to two Messiah figures, one from the line of Ehrman, who is a priestly figure, who will interpret the Torah and will also function as a judge. And we also have a Messiah of Israel, as he's called, who's also a judge figure, but is a Davidic ruler and will exercise some sort of rule in that particular way. In addition to that, in the pseudepigrapha, some 60 plus texts, we have four main passages of references to the Messiah. Psalms of Solomon, chapter 17, we have a Davidic king who's going to appear and is going to send the newly arrived Romans home. We also have in 1st Enoch 37 to 71.
We're closing the building. Be leaving in about 10 minutes, and Mr. Allen's still in his office.
Okay.
So coordinate with him before you leave to set the alarm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Sorry, Jacob, you're going to have to edit out that interruption.
No problem.
In another text, we have in 1st Enoch 37 to 71, a first century text, we actually have a heavenly figure who is a Messiah, who is a judge, who condemns the wicked, who have been exploiting the poor and oppressing the poor. And then two texts from post 70, after the destruction of Jerusalem, 4th Ezra and 2 Baruch. In both texts, we have several visions of messiahs, and it's a bit difficult to always put the details together. But in 4th Ezra, fundamentally, we've got a judge figure who's going to destroy the Roman Empire, who rules for 400 years and then dies and disappears. Subsequently, there's a resurrection and a judgment, but there's no place for the Messiah in any of that. In 2 Baruch, we have a Messiah figure who appears. There are several scenarios: destroys the wicked and a Roman emperor, it looks like, and any nations opposed to Israel, and then establishes the new age, an age of abundant food, of good health, of joy, of peace. The animals get along with each other, the animals get along with humans. It's a very blissful sort of existence. So out of some 65 texts in the pseudepigrapha, some 18 or so texts in the Apocrypha, some 900 plus texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are the main references that we have to a Messiah. So expectations and thinking about a Messiah were very much minority expectations, and they were multiple. They weren't just one thing, as I've demonstrated. So when we come to the New Testament, clearly the designation of Jesus as Messiah or Christ, Messiah is Hebrew-based, Christ is Greek-based, this is a very important designation for Jesus. The words Messiah or Christ literally means one who is anointed or appointed or designated as an agent of God. But the key question is, appointed to do what? Sanctioned to do what? Because there isn't one fixed job description. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is simply called the Christ, and then immediately gets on with what he does in the rest of the gospel, announcing that the empire or the reign or the rule of God is at hand. But we don't have much more a clue than that, except to read the story. In Matthew's gospel, from conception, he's commissioned to manifest God's saving presence as Emmanuel and to save his people from their sins. And then he gets on subsequently in chapter 4 to talk about the reign or the rule or the empire of God. In Luke's gospel, we have several such commissioning statements. The angel announces him as one who will receive the throne of David and will rule forever. Simeon declares that he's going to be a light for Gentiles and glory for Israel. And then when his public ministry actually begins, Jesus reads from the scroll in the synagogue from Isaiah 61, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed, has Christed, has Messiahed me to bring good news to the poor, release for the captives, healing for the blind, and to set the oppressed free." So we have sort of an agenda laid out on the basis of Isaiah 61. In John's gospel, where the term is used some 19 times, it seems to be primarily a guessing game. Can people get the right answer to the question of Jesus' identity? And so it's a challenge for people to identify Jesus as the Christ or God's anointed one. We have passages of speculation in chapters 7 and 10. Who is he? Could he be the Messiah? We have disciples, of course, who confess that Jesus is the Messiah. Martha confesses Jesus is the Christ. So it's a guessing game, people trying to find the right answer in terms of the gospel. So it's a very important term for the Gospels, one that needs definition, but one that is not particularly common in the traditions of early Judaism.
What does the children of Israel and children of the covenant mean? And do these different terminologies affect the New Testament writers?
Fundamentally, there seems to be no particular significance and difference between those descriptions. The notion of covenant was central to Jewish identity. God had chosen Israel as God's special people and brought them into special relationship with God's self. But God had then made a gift of Torah, of the so-called, we often refer to it as law, but a better translation would be of teaching or guidelines, requirements, as a way for Israel to live faithfully within the covenant. If people messed up, the teaching provided a means of atonement and forgiveness. So, and if one persevered, then there was vindication and the sharing of the fullness of divine life. So one got in, so to speak, by being born into covenant and being one of the children of the covenant, and one stayed in by being faithful and living faithfully to covenant requirements. Within those teachings, there were several works or several practices that were especially important for Jewish identity: Sabbath observance, festivals, circumcision, purity laws, and of course, no idols. Idols were things that Gentiles did, but not things that people of the covenant did. These works, these practices, they didn't earn divine favor, but they expressed faithfulness to an identity as being children of the covenant or children of Israel.
What do we know about temple criticism in early Judaism and Christianity?
As we point out in the chapter on temple in the book, Christians have often viewed temple worship negatively. Christians have often talked about it as empty ritual or obsolete sacrifices, which were messy and bloody. That so-called worship in the temple was external, it had no heart. People were going through the motions and all this sort of stuff, which of course is very much a prejudicial view of temple worship and ritual. Early Judaism saw much investment in the temple, much valuing of it. There is praise for the temple. It's a special place for encounter with God. Some saw it as the center of the world. Josephus goes into raptures about how grand and glorious the exterior of the temple is, with its plates of gold, its magnificence that could never be surpassed. Other writings praise the work of priests as absolutely unsurpassable. It was an institution that had big reach into people's lives with festivals and sacrifices. There was, of course, a temple tax. The temple was a big economy and it needed funding. But along with all that sort of praise and adulation and appreciation and investment, there was also a long tradition of criticism from various folks. Prophets, Hebrew Bible prophets, Amos, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all critiqued the gap between worship and the ideals of that worship in the temple and societal practices and structures, often marked by injustice and exploitation of the poor. We've got to remember that in this ancient world, priests were not sort of just like modern clergy, doing their thing in a church on a Sunday, for example. But priests were societal leaders. The chief priest was one of the main rulers, the main leaders of the people. And so the lifestyle of priests, especially chief priests, came under scrutiny. In early Judaism, in the literature that we have, the same two general categories of complaint continue. Both temple procedures, priests not acting according to Torah requirements, and structures marked by injustice and exploitation of the poor, as the folks use their power and privilege to enrich themselves at the expense of poor folks. So part of this critique is that a claim that God is not pleased with these sorts of abuses involving the temple. So post 70, for example, the writing of Baruch sees the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 as punishment for not following the divine commandments and for the priests being, and I quote, false stewards of God's house. They had not performed their duties faithfully in looking after God's house. The Jewish writer Josephus similarly sees judgment being expressed in the year 70 with the Romans as the agent of it for unfaithfulness. And he makes the claim at one point that because of the impiety, the lack of pious observance, God had turned away from the city. God had deemed the temple to be no longer a clean dwelling place for God. And so God had brought the Romans upon us and purification by fire upon the city to chasten us by these calamities. So he sees judgment as worthy and being expressed by the Romans in the events of 70. In the New Testament, we have some of the same sort of both appreciation and critique. In Luke's gospel, the gospel story begins in the temple with Zechariah and with characters like Simeon and Anna and Jesus' presentation in the temple. So we have continuity with Israel's life and a valuing of this institution. But that's not the whole story. For example, in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus enters Jerusalem and turns over the table of the money changers, he quotes from Jeremiah that this is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den for robbers. And the word that's used, the word lestes, could be translated as a den for terrorists, even insurrectionists, which is a damning condemnation of the temple leadership. And in quoting from Jeremiah chapter 7, where we have a catalogue of complaints about unfaithful worship, as well as social injustice, the oppression of orphans and widows and foreigners, the ignoring of the Decalogue, for example. So Matthew's gospel also interprets 70 as punishment for failing to live faithfully but also because this temple leadership did not receive Jesus and was involved in his rejection. We have also in the gospel kind of an alternative temple, because post 70 we don't have one. And so the claim in Matthew's gospel that where 2 or 3 are gathered in the name of Jesus, there he is in the midst, is a way of imagining an alternative temple. The book of Revelation ends with a vision of the New Jerusalem post 70. It's a very big city, but there is no temple in it. And as the last chapters of Revelation explain, there's no need for a temple because God is present. God is encountered everywhere in this city, this New Jerusalem, and doesn't need a special place to be encountered. So that's a reimagining post 70. What's it going to look like without a temple? Some critique there, but there's also an alternative vision of a way ahead.
What do you make of Paul's claim to being a Pharisee?
Christians have often claimed that early Judaism was just one thing. Jews thought, Jews believed, Jews acted all in the same way. But that's a very unnuanced claim and an uninformed one. We know that there was much diversity and many different groups, so we need to recognize that some Jews thought such, and some Jews believed such, and some Jews did this and some did that. We know some of the major groups that make up this diversity. The Pharisees were one of those. So were the Sadducees, a group called the Essenes, often associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, but not exclusively. They had other references, other residences, it seems. Of course, we have priests, we have scribes, we have a group called the Sicarii because they carried daggers and eliminated people by stabbing them in crowds. We have a movement called the Fourth Philosophy, according to Josephus, a group of folks committed to non-cooperation with Rome and violent opposition. So Paul's a Jewish guy, so he's going to belong somewhere in this mix. And of course, there are other groups that I haven't mentioned as well. It's more diverse. So he's going to find his place somewhere. And in Philippians, he describes himself as a Pharisee. Likewise, we have 2 references in the book of Acts where he's identified as a Pharisee. Now, what's interesting about this material is that Paul is the only actual Pharisee that we have who in writing gives us any indication of what Pharisees believed and thought. Josephus gives us some description, but Paul is the only, in a sense, insider who gives us that sort of description. So in talking about himself as a Pharisee in Philippians, he identifies as someone who is zealous for the law and the traditions. Josephus also highlights that quality. Josephus mentions that Pharisees also believe in an afterlife with an immortal soul, and talks about them as societal leaders who are involved in political life and in shaping society. So Paul's description overlaps with some of that. As to the law, blameless. Now, this might surprise some Christians because the Christian stereotype has Jews like Paul being failures, being very frustrated and trying to live according to the law, but never being able to be successful in it. And that view of struggle and failure has often been based on Paul's comments in Romans chapter 7. And in that chapter in Romans chapter 7, Paul talks about how he does what he doesn't want to do and how he doesn't do what he would like to do. I think that's more accurately read in the context of Romans as a description of his experience as a follower of Jesus, rather than his life before he became a follower of Jesus. So being zealous for the law, in Acts chapter 23, he affirms a belief in resurrection, as do other Pharisees in that chapter, along with a belief in angels and spirits. And it's interesting in Acts chapter 23, there's a contrast there with the Sadducees, who don't believe in any resurrection or afterlife or angels or spirits. So Philippians also says that before he became a Jesus follower, being zealous for the law, he also persecuted the church. And we don't know exactly why he did that. There's some speculation. Did he oppose the inclusion of Gentiles, the breaking down of barriers between Jewish folks and Gentiles? Is that part of his opposition? Did he think that these Jesus folks were lax in enforcing aspects of the law and not living faithfully to it, such as circumcision? Or was he deeply offended by their claims of resurrection, that Jesus had been raised from the dead? Because resurrection was talk involving the goal or the end of times, an eschatological talk, when the world was going to be transformed. And anyone who was vaguely comatose could look out the window and could see that the world hadn't been transformed. So did Paul, before he became a Jesus follower, think that these folks were just deluded and crazy and maybe even blasphemous and offensive to God in making such a claim, and he decided they needed to be taken out? We don't know, but those are three possible explanations for his reference to persecuting the church. So this seems to be a key part of his heritage of being a Pharisee, and some of which continues in his identity as a follower of Jesus. He continues to be very concerned with interpretation of the law, and he continues to be very concerned with resurrection.
How does Mark portray the Pharisees? And does he talk about other Jewish groups as well? If so, what are his views of them?
Yeah, when Christians read Gospels like Mark and see references to Pharisees, it's easy, and it's been done for a long time, to draw conclusions that these folks are obsessed with nitpicky, irrelevant little matters, and trying to earn divine favor in the process, and generally bad-tempered and scoldy. Of course, they didn't need to earn divine favor. They were born into covenant and they already had it. And so folks could be forgiven, I think, for being fastidious about faithful living and trying to honor God in that way. In Mark's gospel, Pharisees turn up about 8 or 9 times, so that's not very common. But when they do turn up, the presentation is usually negative. Negative in the sense of being opposed to Jesus and to what Jesus is doing or not doing. So in chapter 2, they're concerned with fasting, or in the case of Jesus, not fasting. And also later in chapter 2 and into chapter 3, they're concerned with observance of the Sabbath. So much so that at chapter 3, verse 6, the narrative says that they start to form a plot to kill Jesus after his healing of a man on the Sabbath. So it's easy to say from these sorts of instances that they're just nitpicky, nasty, harsh creatures with no humanity, no mercy. But I think there are a couple of issues that underline these sorts of actions. We can take the Sabbath one, for example. And I think rather than just sort of thinking of them as being nitpicky, but to think about a fundamental dispute going on in this scene, namely, how should the Sabbath be observed? In other words, the Sabbath was a special day. If God rested on the Sabbath, then, of course, it was particularly important. So how should one honor God? What would be the best societal practice to honor God with a day of rest? And I think Mark's story frames this in verse 4, when Jesus says to them, well, what's the Sabbath about? Is it about doing good or doing harm? Is it about saving a life or killing? Now, that really raises the bar in terms of how to think about Sabbath. They're not just being nitpicky here. There's a fundamental question of how to observe Sabbath in a way that honors God. And you can imagine the Pharisees appealing to the Genesis creation story. God rested from creation. God rested then. If it's good enough for God, it's certainly good enough for people to follow God's example in that way. But Jesus frames it in a different way. What's the impact of this observance of Sabbath? So Sabbath is not some sort of religious nitpicky ritual, but Sabbath has to do with societal practice. It has to do with how people live, and to live in a way that honors God, doing good and bringing life. So I don't think it's fair to think of them as sort of harsh and narrow-minded, but to understand that they are very concerned for faithful living and faithful observance. We have the same sort of deal in chapter 7 when they complain that Jesus doesn't observe purity, washing of hands and pots and cups, those sorts of things. And Jesus counters with a different understanding of purity that begins by a focus on how to care for elderly parents, and then goes on to a very expansive understanding of purity in terms of all sorts of social concerns. Chapter 8, they ask him, well, by what authority do you say and do these things? Who are you is the basic question. Also in chapter 8 at verse 15, he warns his followers about their yeast, about their influence in society. Subsequently, they quiz him about divorce, and they quiz him about paying tax to Rome, because after all, they're societal leaders, and so they are allied with Rome. They have interests in maintaining Roman interests, so the question of paying taxes to Rome is an important one. And then they just suddenly disappear. They're not involved anymore in the story. They're not involved in the Passion narrative. Along the way, in Mark's Gospel, we get other groups, the scribes, chief priests, elders, and Sadducees, and they have similar roles as the Pharisees. They're opposed to Jesus. They disagree with what he does, with what he says. Their Passion predictions link some of them, chief priests, elders, scribes, with Jesus' death, as they form an alliance against him. Whatever differences they have are simply put aside in the gospel story, so that they are united in their opposition to Jesus and to maintaining the status quo as Rome's allies.
How does Matthew's gospel take a mix-match approach to Jewish groups?
Yeah, Matthew is very similar to what I've just talked about in relation to Mark. These groups appear in various combinations with hostility towards Jesus or about Jesus. They're very much societal leaders. They are invested in maintaining the status quo, keeping their Roman bosses happy, and they're not interested in someone who's disturbing matters such as Jesus. And we see this mix and match starting right from the beginning. In chapter 2, verse 4, the chief priests and the scribes side with Herod in trying to find out who Jesus is. So that's two of the groups, chief priests and scribes. Then in chapter 3, the next chapter, the Sadducees and the Pharisees combine to oppose John's baptism. So now we've got the four groups identified. And then the mix and match starts. So in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, Jesus now mixes the Pharisees and the scribes and puts them together. And thereafter, through the rest of the gospel, we get these groups in various combinations: Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, priests, elders, all combined in terms of their opposition to Jesus. So that's very much like Mark's gospel. But Matthew goes a step further. Not only are these groups at the mix and matched, but they're also allied with the devil, which is a very nasty turn of events. So, for example, the devil is identified as a tempter or a tester of Jesus. And subsequently, the gospel uses exactly that same language to identify these leaders who come to tempt or to test Jesus, functioning basically as agents of the devil. Likewise, he uses the adjective evil in exactly the same way. Just as the devil is described as the evil one, so the same language is used for these leadership groups as part of an evil generation. So they become, in Matthew's presentation, not just hostile to Jesus, but agents of the devil in terms of their hostility. And things get ramped up in Matthew's Gospel. In chapter 23, for example, we have this dreadful chapter where Jesus announces woes on the scribes and Pharisees. To announce woes, of course, is to basically say to people, you are condemned, you are out of God's favor, you are consigned to hell. This is not nice, gentle, loving talk at all.
How does John treat Jewish groups, and which one of them is the most prominent in his gospel?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. There are no scribes and no Sadducees in John's gospel. Scribes and Sadducees have been common in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, but they don't turn up in John's gospel. So the Pharisees, you would think, would emerge as the most dominant group, the societal leaders, and they get allied with chief priests. And one of the things that they seem to be constantly doing in John's gospel is watching Jesus. Wherever he goes, they sort of pop up, they're watching as well. They resent his influence with the people, but Jesus is a little intimidated by them, and he actually leaves Judea when they find out some information about him. But more prominent in the gospel, more prominent than the Pharisees, is a group that's identified some 70 or so times called the Judaioi. That's the Greek word. It's a difficult word to translate. Do we translate it as the Jews? Do we translate it as the Judeans? Do we translate it as elite leaders? Jesus is a Jewish guy, but he's not part of this particular group. This group are opposed to Jesus throughout the gospel. And in several places in John's gospel, Pharisees and the Judaioi seem to blend together. In chapter 1, we've got a reference to the Pharisees, and then a couple of verses later, we've got a reference to this Judaioi group. Same thing happens in chapter 9, a reference to the Pharisees, and just a couple of verses later, they suddenly become the Judaioi. So this term, the Judaioi, seems to embrace chief priests, Pharisees, as opponents of Jesus. But that being said, John is unusual in another way. There is one Pharisee who gets a little bit of press in John's gospel, and that's the character Nicodemus. Nicodemus appears 3 times in the gospel. First of all, in chapter 3, he's attracted to Jesus by the signs that Jesus performs, and he comes to Jesus and says, well, it's obvious that you're a teacher who's come from God, but then he doesn't seem to be able to understand the lesson that the teacher then offers in terms of being born from above, which he interprets the Greek word, anothen, as being born again. How can I enter again into my mother's womb? So the question, of course, is ridiculous, and he's made to look ridiculous as an opponent of Jesus. But then in chapter 7, he argues against some other Pharisees and chief priests who are very much opposed to Jesus. He argues for giving Jesus a hearing before he ought to be condemned. So he kind of is sympathetic to Jesus. And then he turns up again in chapter 19 when he assists Joseph of Arimathea in the burial of Jesus. He comes to that burial with a large amount of spices to anoint Jesus' body with an abundant quantity of spices. How do we interpret that? Is this an act of devotion as someone who's come to understand Jesus much more than he did in chapter 3? Or is it a demonstration that he just continues to miss the point, that he's brought a bunch of spices, a lot of spices? He intends to keep Jesus dead for a very long time. So has he continued to miss the point? So it's kind of an open question in chapter 19.
How does Luke Acts treat Jewish groups?
In Luke Acts, I think things are just a wee bit more nuanced. Certainly there's hostility and opposition and the same sort of issues around hand washing, Sabbath, and who you eat with. These are all societal questions. The Pharisees are wealthy folks. Jesus actually criticizes them for their wealth. They're high status folks connected with the ruling elite. They have positions of influence in Jerusalem and Galilean villages. And yet there are some scenes of cooperation where they cooperate with Jesus. Pharisees invite Jesus to eat with them. They inquire about the coming kingdom. In Acts, some Pharisees are even said to believe in Jesus. So they've gone completely over to Jesus' side. And in chapter 23, some Pharisees support Paul when he appeals to them about a belief in resurrection. And a group of Pharisees say, yeah, us, we too, we also do that. In contrast with Sadducees, who are also there, who deny resurrection. And so we've got a differentiation. Yet for all of that, there continue to be conflicts. Jesus curses the scribes and the Pharisees. He condemns their wealth, he condemns their hypocrisy, he condemns their societal privilege, their disdain for poor folks who are marginal. And in all of this, he gives very minimal role to the Sadducees. There are very few references to the Sadducees.
How are angels and demons understood in early Judaism and Christianity? What are the differences and the misconceptions people have about it?
Yeah, in the chapter on demons and angels, we note some variety of attitudes in Christian circles about these powers. In some parts of Christian traditions, demons are blamed for everything. The demons made me do it. The devil made me do it. I take no responsibility. Every human foible is accounted for by an action of demons. Everything that goes wrong is the demons messing with my life. Often, at the other end of the spectrum, demons are granted no reality at all, but when they're referred to in the Gospels, it's psychologized. The presence of demons or the devil are also used in a polemical sense in the Gospel, which is very unfortunate. The reference to Jews in John chapter 8 as children or agents of the devil, I think, is an absolute low point in the New Testament writings. In early Judaism, we have basically three categories. We have angels, good angels, who are created by God, who have various roles as messengers or agents of God. And the word that we have in English, agents, comes from a Greek word, angelos, which literally means a messenger. So it doesn't have to be a heavenly being, a flappy thing with wings, but any human being could be an angel who is a messenger. But in the traditions of early Judaism, these are heavenly creatures. Some of them serve in the heavenly temple. Some are in constant praise of God. Some are involved in interceding for human beings. Some have particular duties and responsibilities in relation to parts of creation. There are hierarchies of angels. There are archangels, ruling angels who act on behalf of the nations. They go to war on behalf of nations. And of course, sometimes angels are active among human beings, often unrecognized in our midst. In the New Testament, the most common reference to these sorts of angels occur in the book of Revelation. Heavenly figures in praise and worship. We have a number of scenes of praise and worship in Revelation. We have trumpet blowing angels that reveal divine judgment. We have angels that confine the devil, angels that reveal the new Jerusalem. The archangel Michael and other angels remove the devil from heaven. So angels are particularly active in the book of Revelation. So that's one category, the good angels. Second category is the fallen angels. And a text like 1 Enoch, chapters 6 through 11, particularly focus on these characters. These angels don't want to stay in heaven any longer and decide to come to earth. And when they come to earth, they're particularly taken with earthly women. And so they mate with earthly women. And the children that are born are giants. And these giants wreak havoc on planet Earth. They teach humans all sorts of forbidden knowledge about war and about sorcery and about spells and astrology. But God binds them and says that on the day of judgment they will be imprisoned forever. But they haven't finished their destructive evil work, because demons or evil spirits originate with these fallen angels. When these fallen angels are bound, their spirits survive, and their spirits are demons that continue the work of the fallen angels in wreaking havoc among human beings. They do violence, they cause evil, they lead astray both individuals and nations, they provoke wars and hostilities, they cause death. We have the story of Sarah in the book of Tobit, and this poor unfortunate woman marries 7 husbands, but every time on the wedding night, the demon Asmodeus kills each one of her husbands. So yeah, she has a particularly sad and horrible life because of the action of the demons. The leader of the demons has various names. The most common, of course, we know as Satan and the devil, but also other names: Belial and Beliar, symbols of wickedness; Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons; Mastema, one who is particularly hostile. There were ways of having remedies against the power of these demons. You could study and obey Torah. There were prayers and hymns that offered protection. There were rituals, again coming back to Sarah in the book of Tobit. She used to burn a heart and the liver of a fish to find protection against the demons. There are prayers of exorcism and laying on of hands. So there are some forms of protection to try to ward off these powers, magic spells as well, to protect oneself. Of course, there are common references in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels. References to demons can be polemic against Jesus and John, both of whom are said to be in the control of demons. I've already mentioned the reference to Jews in John chapter 8 as being children of the devil. Paul sees demons present with idols and with sacrifices, another reason to keep away from them. Stories of demon possession causing illnesses are often proliferate through the Gospels. One of the studies of demon possession has shown that demon possession is quite common in situations of imperial power and imperial domination, where demons represent the invading force of an imperializer such as Rome. So in Mark chapter 5, we have the story of a man who is possessed by demons. He's wild, he's ultra strong, he lives amongst the tombs in a cemetery in a place called Gerasa, which means in Hebrew a place of being banished or to drive out. And his name is Legion, which of course is the basic unit of the Roman army, who invaded Gerasa and attacked it in the 68 to 70 CE war. And so Jesus comes into the situation. This guy is all about destruction and social alienation. He's not restrained by chains. He's wild. And Jesus arrives and casts out the demon into the pigs, which, interestingly, were the mascot of the 10th Roman Legion, a legion that had a key role in the attack on Jerusalem in the war of 66 to 70. So in the story, the demons and Roman power are aligned, and Jesus is shown to be a superior figure with superior power. He, of course, sends the pigs into the sea. They're destroyed, and it's no surprise that the folks living round about want Jesus to go away, because he's just wiped out a major source of their economic well-being. But the story is a fantasy of repair of imperial damage and a defeat of Roman military power But we have lots of other stories of exorcisms, especially around disease as well.
We have a super chat question from iFishNatai. Thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on the reputation of James among Pharisees?
Yeah, we have the story of the execution of James, in which the Pharisees have a leading role. Clearly, they were not particularly well disposed to him and to his interpretations and to his power, and so he gets eliminated.
How does Mark portray demons?
As I've just I think I've just answered that, Jacob, in terms of talking about the scene in Mark chapter 5. Yeah, do you want me to do it? Yeah,
I'll skip that. I'll just skip that question.
As long as you
What are the two claims that the preachers? Let me start over. What are the two claims that the preachers in Christian pulpits make about the Messiah?
Yeah, as we talk about in the chapter in the book, there seem to be two dominant claims that preachers make, and it's quite common in Christian circles to hear this sort of talk. One, all Jews were waiting for the Messiah. And secondly, when Jesus didn't fit the profile, they rejected him and killed him. Both claims are simply not true. All Jews were not waiting for a Messiah. It was a minority and marginal expectation. It's clearly important to the New Testament writers, but not all Jewish folks were waiting for a Messiah at all. In fact, very few seem to be. And secondly, there wasn't one particular profile that the Messiah had to fit. The word simply means anointed or sanctioned or empowered to do a particular role, but that role has to be defined. And as we've seen in the texts from early Judaism, we have very different understandings of what the Messiah does. In one text, he drives out the Romans by saying, "Romans, go home." In another text, he's a heavenly figure who exercises judgment. In another text, he rules for 400 years and then dies, disappears, goes away. In another text, he establishes the new age with all fine and good things, abundant food, good health, peace, joy, tranquility, etc. So there's no one profile for a Messiah to fit into. Jesus is anointed, Jesus is appointed, Jesus is designated, Jesus is sanctioned, but the big question is, for what? And the only way of answering that question, as far as the Gospels is concerned, is to read on through the Gospel story.
Why is it believed that the Jews killed Jesus?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. And I think at the heart of it, it has to do with how we, readers in the Christian tradition, have been trained to read and interpret the Gospels. And I think there are a couple of factors here. The first one is that the Gospel stories, long before we get to the cross, the Gospel stories emphasize Jesus and the Jerusalem and the Jewish leaders in conflict. And so often that conflict is interpreted in religious terms. You know, Sabbath is a religious matter. Purity matters, it's a religious matter. Fasting, it's a religious matter. And I think that interpretation doesn't help us at all. These folks that Jesus conflicts with are not primarily, exclusively religious characters. They don't have just a religious role. They're not just like modern clergy, so to speak. They're societal leaders. They're elite folks. They have power, and they have alliance with Rome. They're in power because Rome permits them to be in power in Judea, and their loyalty is to the Romans as much as it is to their own heritage and traditions. And I think they were in a very difficult spot. But if we don't read the gospel with that awareness, then we simply read these figures as as religious figures, as isolated Jewish folks, all on their own. And of course, chapter after chapter after chapter, before we get to the Passion narrative and the crucifixion scene, highlights them as the main players. So that's one factor. Here's the second factor which goes with it, and it's namely the factor of invisible Romans. Invisible Romans with who don't seem to appear in the story. And unless we as readers know that these stories are set in a context of Roman power, set in a context of Roman domination, and unless we bring that to the fore, then the Romans remain invisible. And likewise, as part of our not realizing those sorts of factors, then it's very easy for us to not know anything about Roman governors. Suddenly Pilate turns up, and he is presented often as a figure who's sort of being bullied into doing what the Jerusalem leaders want. But of course, that's not true, because only the Roman governor had the power of execution. Only the Roman governor had the power of capital punishment. Only Pilate could put Jesus to death. Now, he gets minimal press in the narratives, but he has huge power here to decide Jesus' fate, Jesus' destiny. And so when he keeps asking questions about Jesus, why should I crucify him? What wrong has he done? Without understanding the roles of governors and the power of governors to execute, and without understanding his alliance with the Jerusalem leaders, he sounds reluctant, he sounds weak, he sounds as though he kind of likes Jesus, and doesn't see him as being a problem at all. Plus, we throw in an understanding of Jesus' sinlessness, so that translates into Jesus being innocent, which means that we misread the whole scene. And I would suggest that Pilate's questions are actually an act of astute governing. He's going to crucify one who's been identified to him as King of the Jews. He's going to crucify someone who is understood to have some support amongst Jewish folks. He's a problem. He's a threat. So he wants to know how much support, how much fallout is there going to be when he crucifies Jesus? What does he need to prepare for in terms of popular uprisings if a popular king is going to be put to death? I think it's quite an astute act of governing on his part as he tries to assess the damage. And a third factor that goes with all of this is that I think there's sort of a constant circle in action here. With these misinterpretations, our hostility is directed as Christian readers towards the Jews, and has been for 2,000 years. This blame the Jews approach was not actually renounced until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, which wasn't that long ago. And since then, various Protestant groups have followed suit and made a similar renunciation. But we've got a bunch of unlearning and new learning to do to get out of this circle of rereading with these particular presuppositions. The rereading reinforces the presuppositions lead to that same reading, and round and round and round in circles we go. And of course, much of this has to do with self-definition. One of the ways that groups define themselves is to define themselves over against an opposing group, a group that they can be superior to. And much of this is fed into Christian superiority. We received Jesus, but they crucified him. And that has fed a Christian self-identity, a self-definition that I think is extremely problematic, but could be addressed if we put some other factors into play in our interpretations of what's happening around this passion narrative, the key role of the Romans, the key role of alliance with the Romans, and Jesus' identity as one who is very guilty as King of the Jews, very guilty of treason, very guilty of subversion, and one who, in Roman perspective, deserves to die, and to die as soon as possible.
What are the differences in the resurrection accounts of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John?
Yeah, Christians have often acclaimed resurrection as our distinctive. It's the thing that we are known for. Unfortunately, as we point out in the chapter in the book, that's simply not true. There is a long tradition of Jewish speculation about different forms of afterlife, and we discuss some of these in the chapter. But included in those expectations of, and speculations about afterlife is an affirmation of resurrection. Pharisees believe in resurrection, so we're told. And we have the story in the Apocrypha in 2nd Maccabees, chapter 7, key chapter in understanding a development of resurrection, when the tyrant Antiochus puts to death 7 brothers who have defied him. And one by one, he tortures them, and one by one, they die. And one by one, they express a confidence that God will bring them back to life. God will raise them because they have been faithful to him. So resurrection is justice doing work. The tyrant can't keep the enemies dead, and God will raise them again to life. God will heal their bodies, so resurrection is somatic, and God will reunite them with each other and with their poor mother who has to watch this dreadful punishment and dreadful torture that is going on. So resurrection is also societal. So there's a long and rich tradition there that the Gospels buy into and build on. So the major differences in the Gospels is primarily about length and content. So in Mark's Gospel, probably the earliest Gospel to be written, we have just 8 verses. Interestingly, the resurrected Jesus doesn't turn up. There's no risen Jesus in this story. The women, followers, come to the tomb with spices, lots of spices, expecting to anoint a dead body to keep Jesus dead, not expecting resurrection. But there's an angel who turns up, who announces that Jesus has been raised, God has overcome Roman death-dealing power, and tells the disciples to go tells the women to go and tell the disciples to go to Galilee where they'll meet Jesus. But the women in fear flee and say nothing. And that's where the gospel ends. How's that for a downer? Well, Matthew's gospel rewrites this and edits it. And we have 3 sections in Matthew's Gospel, and what was 8 verses in Mark now becomes 20 verses in Matthew. So it's gotten longer. The first part, we have the women come to the tomb, but they don't bring spices. There are no spices. They come to see the tomb, which is language for expecting resurrection. They've understood that Jesus will be raised on the 3rd day, and they come looking for that resurrection. The angel announces resurrection, and they encounter the risen Jesus. So now we've got a risen Jesus in the story, who tells them to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. So that leads then to an interruption. Before we have the scene in Galilee, we've got a second scene where we get an alternative narrative announced. The chief priests and the elders have gotten together and have devised a cover-up scheme, an alternative story. Jesus is not in the tomb. So they bribed the guards to say that they fell asleep. And while they were asleep, Jesus' disciples came and stole the body. That's an alternative story to explain the empty tomb. But then we get to part 3, and we're now in Galilee on a mountain with Jesus and 11 male disciples. The women who were at the tomb don't seem to be included here. Jesus claims all authority in heaven and earth has been granted to me. And in a very imperialist gesture, he sends the disciples in a worldwide mission to make disciples. And that's where the gospel ends. Very different ending from Mark's gospel. Luke's gospel, we now have a much longer account, 53 verses, not 20, 53 verses, and we've got a couple of big additions here. Yep, we have the same sort of appearance scene. But then one of the big additions is a story of two people who are heading from Jerusalem to a village of Emmaus. They are disappointed with Jesus. They thought he was going to set the people free, but he ended up getting crucified. That's not what they expected. So while they're walking and commiserating with each other, Jesus joins them. The risen Jesus joins them. So we've got an appearance story. But they don't recognize him until the evening when he breaks bread at the evening meal. They recognize him then. We have another big recognition scene that's added in Luke's account. Jesus joins a gathering of the disciples, shows them his body, his hands and his feet, presumably scarred by crucifixion. He eats fish in front of them, and then commissions them to a mission activity among the nations, but they're to wait in Jerusalem until what God has promised comes upon them. This anticipates the giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost in the book of Acts. And then, something that we don't get in Mark or Matthew, Jesus is taken up into heaven. We have an ascension story. John's Gospel, now we get 2 chapters of resurrection material, slightly longer than Luke's material. We have a bunch of appearance stories. Jesus appears to Mary, who thinks that he's the gardener at first. Then he appears to a series of followers, gatherings of disciples. Jesus appears and commissions them. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. And he breathes on them, and they receive the Holy Spirit. Very different from Luke's understanding of Pentecost. 50 days later, Jesus breathes on them. They receive the Spirit. He appears to Thomas, a famous scene. Then we have a scene on the beach. 7 of the disciples have gone back to fishing on the Sea of Tiberias. This is not recreational stuff. They've gone back to their way of life before Jesus. So they've given up totally on Jesus. But then Jesus appears on the beach. They've caught nothing. Jesus orders them to cast out the net again, and they catch a whole bunch of fish, and they have breakfast. Then Jesus has a special encounter with Peter. 3 times, do you love me? And commissions Peter to a leadership role, feed my sheep. So we've got this expansion of resurrection stories, an expansion of understandings of resurrection. There are more appearance stories with both recognition and non-recognition. There's much more focus on Jesus' body, and there's much more focus on Jesus' commission to the followers to an activity of mission work. And of course, we get an ascension story as well. So we've got an expanding set of stories and understandings.
And when was Mark's resurrection account expanded with the goal to harmonize the gospel stories that came later?
Yeah. So the original ending of Mark's gospel comes at verse 8 of chapter 16. But then sometime later in the 2nd or 3rd centuries, we get 2 expansions, 2 editings, if you like, 2 touch-ups to that story. One of these is called a short ending, just 1 verse, which emphasizes the appearance of Jesus commissioning the women. They tell Peter, and Jesus appears. So it's a much more upbeat sort of ending. What was failure, what was fear, is now turned into a success story. The women do what Jesus tells them to do. They tell Peter, Jesus appears to Peter. But there's also another longer version of the end of the gospel that appears sometime around late 2nd into 3rd century. This longer version is about 8 verses, and it's also a story of failure turned into success. But its success is largely drawn on features from these other gospels. So, for example, there's a story, a very brief story, of a couple of people who are out walking, and Jesus appears to them. It's nowhere near as long as Luke's story of the journey to Emmaus, nowhere near as long, just a couple of verses, but it's the same basic idea. There's another appearance story where Jesus appears to a large group of Jesus followers and commissions them to mission activity. So again, like Matthew, like Luke, and like John. So this longer ending to Mark's gospel changes the original ending significantly. Success, not failure. Recognition, not absence, marks this longer ending with some conformity to the other gospels. And this seems to take place late in the second or during the third centuries as a touch-up to Mark's more mysterious and elusive ending original to the gospel.
Who is involved in God's new age?
We have throughout this material an expectation of a new era, a new age that God is going to create. Now, in some Christian circles, this sort of end of the present world is a bit of a joke. You know, we've also the cartoons with the character signs carrying the sign, the end of the world. In some other places in the Christian tradition, it becomes an absolute obsession, fed by daily news reports and social media and strange interpretations by some preachers of certain scriptures. Often in this sort of obsessive commitment to eschatological things, it's a matter of having the right ticket to get out of here. And usually that means the right words of confession, at least as some understand them to be the right words to get into heaven or to get into this new age. And usually that's confined for a few select privileged folks, and the rest can basically go to hell. There's a long tradition of this reflection on eschatological, or it's often called teleological expectations. This reflection is born of crisis, where the world is perceived to be not as God intends it to be. It's often colored with despair, but it's also born of hope for divine intervention to restore the world to original good life, like a restoration to the Garden of Eden, to a world marked by God's justice and good things for all people. So who's involved in this? Well, it depends on which texts you read. Often the traditions see a judgment taking place, a separation of the wicked and from the righteous. The wicked are often defined as the powerful and the greedy rich, the oppressive who use imperial powers in a destructive way for their own benefit at the expense of poor folks. So the righteous are often the exploited poor who will be vindicated. We have the Beatitude, of course, in Matthew's Gospel. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. They will inherit the earth. The meek in Psalm 37, which is where it's quoted from, the meek are the poor. But often in these early Jewish texts, there's a timetable, there's a scheme that's set out of things that have to happen that work towards this end transformation. And sometimes there are a number of stages. Sometimes there are 4, there are 7, there are 10, there are 12, which gives a sense of sort of divine ordering. You know, God is really in control, even though it doesn't look like it. Even in the midst of all this chaos, God is working out God's purposes and God's plans, and there's the destiny of accountability. There will be justice in the end. The big, bad, nasty oppressors, the exploiters, the wicked, powerful, they will get their accountability and their punishment. In terms of some Christian texts, it's hard to know from Paul exactly who is involved. I think there's some tension in Paul's thought here. On one hand, Paul emphasizes a lot of commitment to Jesus, to be faithful to Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15, which is his extended discussion of resurrection, there seems to be a division there between those who belong to Christ, his language of faithfulness is common, and those who don't belong to Christ. And the latter, particularly every ruler and power, are going to be destroyed. But through the chapter, he also uses all language. All die in Adam, so all will be made alive in Christ. Does all mean all? Or does the all only refer to those who are in Christ will be made alive? That's an interpretive dilemma. But maybe all does mean all for Paul, because at the end of Romans chapter 11, he seems to envision that God's merciful faithfulness, and I think this is a big deal for Paul, God being faithful to God's commitments to bless all the peoples of the earth, the promise to Abraham, and Paul is a big fan of Abraham and a big fan of that promise, that God will, at the end of Romans 11, mercy everybody, all Israel and all Gentiles, into God's purposes. Now, just when he has said that, and inquiring minds want to know, well, how's that going to happen, Paul? How does that get worked out? He stops. And instead of addressing how does that happen question, he goes into a doxology and blesses the greatness of God, the mercy of God, the power of God, the grace of God, which somehow is going to be sufficient to this task. Matthew's gospel, just to do a comparison, works with a division of judgment. But contrary to much emphasis in some Christian circles around having the right words, the right confession, in Matthew's gospel, the emphasis is on doing the will of God. So the Sermon on the Mount ends, after all its ethical instruction about how to live in the reign and the purposes and the empire of God, with all its ethical instruction, ends with a story of the wise man and the foolish man, and their building of houses on the rock and on the sand. And the house that's built on the rock is equated with hearing and doing Jesus' teaching. And it stands in the storm, which is kind of an image of judgment. But the house that's built on the sand collapses in the storm. And that house is identified as those who hear but do not do or do not act upon the teaching of Jesus. Doing the teaching seems to be the criterion for judgment. And we get the same thing in the famous vision in Matthew chapter 25 of the judgment of the sheep and the goats. The judgment here concerns not individuals, but nations. Nations appear before the victorious, all-triumphant King, Son of Man, Jesus. And the basis of the judgment, it's not confession, but there's just one question to be answered: whether the nation has cared for the vulnerable, the broken, the poor, those who lack basic essentials for good life, the hungry, the homeless, those lacking clothing, those lacking food. When have you done this to any of these folks? When have you cared for the desperate, the vulnerable, the poor? So Matthew has a very different vision of who's included and who's excluded, whether one has done the teaching, has acted on the teaching of Jesus, especially towards the poor and vulnerable.
And for my final question, what are the common misconceptions about women and non-Jews, Gentiles, in early Judaism and Christianity?
As we note in the chapter in this book, and it's the final chapter in the book, one of the common misperceptions about women in the time of early Judaism and in the early Christian movement is a perception that women were restricted to homes, they weren't permitted to appear in public, they weren't permitted to speak to men, they weren't permitted to own property, they didn't have any agency, they were subject to oppressive purity laws around childbirth and menstruation, all bad things, until Jesus comes along and liberates women from all bad things. And this sort of understanding works on the same model of triumphalism, victorious Christianity, the superior religion overcoming inferior and poor and bad Judaism. And that's a dichotomy that we have to abandon, and for Christian folks we have to repent of. In truth, both Judaism and Christianity have traditions that go in both directions. Traditions that have oppressed women and traditions that have recognized women as valuable, contributing members of their communities. And sometimes, and this might seem strange, but sometimes these differing perspectives appear in the same author, in tension with each other. So Josephus, for example, this Jewish historian, writes a lot of stuff about early Judaism, and we learn a lot of stuff about early Judaism from him. He's invaluable, even as he has his own agenda and point of view. He can declare that women are inferior to men, while he also writes about powerful women in the families of the ruling Hasmoneans and the ruling Herodians, powerful women, women with power, women with wealth, women with influence, women with standing, women with status, women who are very much significant players in what is happening. No inferiority, but very much influencing what's going on. In fact, one of the Hasmonean women that he writes about was a queen, and was queen of Judea for 9 years. And in the account of her rule, he does not complain about her being a woman. He does not complain about her gender. We have a text called Genesis Apocryphon, which retells the story of Abraham and Sarah to a significant degree. And in that story, Sarah is a complex character. She has agency. She has abilities. She has skills. She's a complex character. She's not a sort of cut-out cardboard. She's a real person. And there are lots of other women of similar ilk. I've mentioned Sarah in the book of Tobit. There's a story of Judith, who takes agency and frees the people, faithfully exercising her Jewish identity and killing the Assyrian general. Susanna, who is vindicated in a struggle with some men. The mother of the 7 sons who are martyred by Antiochus, as she watches each of her children martyred in front of her. Brave, faithful, favored by God. We have Babitha, a whole collection of material about Babitha, who owns property, who divorces her husband. Women with agency, women with character, courage. And we have the same sort of dynamic in New Testament texts. We have stories that marginalize women, and yet we have stories that recognize women with power and leadership. So, for example, in the Gospels, we have a lot of focus on the male disciples. And it's only near the end that we learn in several of the Gospels that there are women equally who are followers of Jesus, who bring their own resources, who support Jesus, who contribute to Jesus' activity, who have an important role. In the Passion narrative, it's the male disciples who run away, but the women remain faithful. In Matthew, it's the women who come to the tomb looking for resurrection, and it's the women who have to be sent by the risen Jesus to go find the disciples and tell them that he's going to meet them in Galilee. They become the first proclaimers of resurrection gospel. So women have agency. Women seek healing. A woman approaches Jesus to get healing for her daughter. And when Jesus is less than enthusiastic about this, and that downright insulting, she remains persistent until Jesus delivers that healing. Other women who come to Jesus for healing, and in these scenes there's no mention of being escorted by a man. There's no explanation for being out in public, no defense, no wrongdoing. There's no concern about purity. There's no ban on touching Jesus. Women have agency. Jesus' mother tells him to address the shortage of wine at the wedding at Cana. Mary and Martha seem to own their own home. There's all sorts of inscriptional evidence from the ancient world of women working in a whole range of occupations, out in public, providing services, producing products, mostly poor women, most of the population, contributing economically to their households, but there are also prominent elite Jewish women as well. Can't finish this without talking about Paul, who's often been a controversial figure concerning roles of women. Is he a misogynist? I don't think so. It's mainly letters attributed to Paul written in his name, but probably letters that he didn't write. Letters like Ephesians and Colossians and 1 Timothy, where we find the instructions for women to be subordinated with restricted domestic roles. Now, I don't think Paul wrote these, but I think followers of Paul in subsequent generations or so wrote in his name as a way of honoring him, but writing content that differs from what we get in letters written by Paul himself. So, for example, different from what we have in Romans chapter 16, the final letter to the churches in Rome. It sort of functions like a church directory, but without the pictures. Paul greets 27 people that he has at least heard the names of, some of whom he knows, but at least he knows the names of these folks who are in the churches in Rome. 9 of them are women, 9 of the 27. And 7 of those 9, he particularly commends for their work in the gospel. Now that's a key word, for their work in the gospel. He calls them co-workers and uses the verb to work in the gospel. Key word, because he uses exactly that same language of work for his own ministry and leadership, his own work of preaching, teaching, pastoring. This is what these women are doing as well. He allies himself with them and recognizes their work as church leaders, and he commends them for what he's doing. He doesn't tell them to be quiet. He doesn't tell them to go home. He doesn't tell them to submit to men. He commends them. He praises them for their work in preaching the gospel. So we have mixed texts, both in early Judaism and in the New Testament and in early Christianity. Some oppressive, but some dignifying and some respectful and recognizing significant contributions that women were making. As for presentation of Gentiles in 2 sentences, again, we have, especially in the Gospels, a recognition of the importance of Abraham and the promise to Abraham to bless all the nations of the earth, that Gentiles are also included in the divine purposes. And in texts of early Judaism, we have both an emphasis on protecting Jewish identity, being faithful to the covenant, being faithful to Torah, being faithful to those distinctive works of Sabbath observance and festivals and purity and circumcision, and no idols, because those are Gentile things. But there's also a recognition that Gentiles can be and are included in the purposes of God. So again, as with the roles of women, we have traditions going in different directions.
And before we close, I want to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase Early Judaism and the New Testament will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Warren Carter.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jacob, for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.